So I have a few short questions. The first one is quite a straightforward one. Well, we'd imagine it would be straightforward, but the answer could be a little complex. So trying to break this down for possibly people who've never thought about this issue before, although hopefully some of you have. So can you explain what the coloniality of power means and where this idea came from?
Yeah, that is a big question. So I might take some time to answer both parts of the question. But first, before I answer the question, I want to go over a bigger concept, perhaps, that allows us to have perhaps another image of the world. And this image will hopefully help situate this analytical concept in the concrete world. And the image of the world that I'm referring to is really just a frame of reference. And this huge concept that I'm referring to is the modern colonial world system. It's a really, really big concept that gives an alternative understanding of the world. So what assumptions, for instance, do we have of the world? What narratives maintain these assumptions? These are questions that we could ask ourselves through this concept. How is the modern world configured? What is hidden from view? Those are just some questions that I'm thinking about. And also, how are some people perceived within the modern world or modern colonial world? And what image is usually made more important, usually through dominant discourses, is the modern side of things, the modern institutions and so forth. And this dominant image is usually accompanied by other concepts that most of you are perhaps familiar with, such as progress, development, globalization, civilization, and all of these terms. What they do is they naturalize history in many ways and the contemporary order of things by giving one image, one dominant image of the world and one understanding of social reality, which in many ways prevents us from thinking of alternatives or seeing alternatives. And these dominant narratives and perspectives, what they do is they permanently foreclose, or they aim to permanently foreclose, the possibility of something else, of perhaps a more just world, where perhaps the dignity of life and coexistence may flourish. So that's what dominant narratives tend to do. So these dominant concepts that I just referred to, such as progress, development, etc., and the images that they prevent, these images that these concepts give, they prevent us from seeing value in any alternative way of existing and relating in and with the world. So the modern colonial world system, what it does is it gives also an alternative ontological or assumption of reality, an alternative assumption of the world. And it also allows us to ask other questions, such as what institutions exist within the social reality of the modern world? Why do they exist? What do these institutions achieve? When we only emphasize, for instance, just these modern notions of progress, development, and so forth, what do they hide? Are they hiding something violent? So this modern colonial system, I like to think about it, the modern side and the underside, or the darker side of modernity, is the colonial side. And that's why this concept is stated as such, the modern colonial world system, right? So we could start thinking about this relationship between colonial relations of power and the modern world.
Perfect.
So that's the image that I wanted to provide. So to begin to answer your question regarding coloniality of power, since we now have another image in the relationship between modernity and coloniality, how does the colonial side, let's say, create or configure what we know as modernity? And by seriously considering the colonial side of things, we begin to see that modernity or any of its institutions or projects, such as neoliberal globalization, are not natural phenomena as they are usually presented, since what dominant narratives do is that they present modernity as something that is born in Europe, that is endogenous to Europe, and that therefore just makes it natural, right? It's just the natural order of things. This is just exactly what we should be living in, and these are the institutions that exist. So what we know as modernity, as decolonial thought argues, cannot exist without colonialism. And what I will discuss in just a moment is what's considered coloniality of power, the colonial relations of power that exists. So within with the conquest or colonization of the so-called New World, and the unimaginable levels of exploitation through slavery, new social arrangements were formed, new institutions were formed that were founded upon racial logics and hierarchies, where the colonized were presented as subhuman others, whose sole purpose was really just physical labor. And many well-known philosophers such as Locke, Hobbes, Kant, Hegel, they made these claims. They justified, in their discourses, justified colonial relations, power, colonial domination, and capitalist exploitation. So that's what coloniality also does. It really makes the relationship between the material and symbolic much clearer. So it is through domination and exploitation that creates the conditions of possibility for modernity to emerge. And so with colonization, there begins to form this racial division of labor. Cedric Robinson also makes these arguments. Wage labor is usually for white people, and forced, coerced, and indentured labor was meant for those who were classified as inferior races. And this is why the concept of coloniality of power is so important, because race, understood here as a category meant for social classification, becomes the central axis around this modern colonial world. That's how it's structured. That's how the modern colonial world system is structured, around the axis of race. So when we begin to use this frame of reference as the modern colonial world system, it provides a more complex image, as I stated before, more complex image of the world. And we begin to see that social reality as presented by dominant narratives is not necessarily what they seem. So coloniality of power helps us unveil this violent constitution of modernity. And that's why Aníbal Quijano in 1991, just to start thinking about the second part of this question, he understood coloniality and he conceptualized this in 1991 as a multi-dimensional term, where race, once again, is a dominant category to classify colonized enslaved people, and it becomes the central organizing principle of this world system. So it's about the systematic control, and it's multidimensional because of that, because it considers all spheres of social existence, such as labor relations, intersubjective relations, family, gender, sex, authority. And if we think about it, coloniality of power already conceptualizes this notion of coloniality of knowledge, which others have taken up, such as Walter Mignolo. So Quijano, from the beginning, was thinking about this relationship between the symbolic and material entanglement. So the modernity and coloniality, and some of the ways that coloniality or decoloniality have been adopted. And I think this is one of the things that I've critiqued and I share in social media, is that it tends to be consumed in such a way where the symbolic always is always overemphasizing, or is overemphasized, and the material is ignored, right? So there's this notion where coloniality of knowledge is the most important part, where the materiality of coloniality is ignored. So the concrete relations of power tend to be ignored. So that's one of just the overall kind of summary of coloniality of power that I think are important to consider.